Well, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I've just, first of all, got to start out by just extending such a grateful heart and such just a strong thank you for this opportunity to speak in front of you all today. I guess it's probably been about 2 months since the last time I preached, and I've been really wanting to preach since then, and I'm so glad for this opportunity. I'm so glad for you all being here. You know, a great majority of us were here this morning, and we heard a fantastic lesson from Terry Francis, a fantastic lesson. And you all heard that I was going to be speaking tonight, and you came back. You came back. I appreciate that. I do. I appreciate that. And I also appreciate, and I know I'm kind of going on a tangent, but I appreciate the hospitality that's been extended to me from this church family. It's not easy to leave a church that you've been going to for virtually your whole life and just go to a new congregation about 800 miles away, but I thank you all so much. Now, as we're diving into the lesson today, I want to start with a question. And I apologize for the nature of this question. It's quite academic, quite challenging, but I didn't really know another way to start this lesson. So, has anybody in here ever taken a test? Has anybody in here ever taken a test? It can be anything. A math test, a science test, driving test, your forklift certification. I don't know. But what was the goal of that test? Why did you take it? Was it to measure your ability in a certain aspect? Was it because your professor wanted to tank your grade? Was it because you had to take this test to be able to perform a certain activity like driving? You know, I took my driver's test probably 2 years ago. And I can tell you the standards are not as high as they should be. Of course, you all probably know that because most of you all drove here, so you can see for yourselves. But I really like the definition that is used by dictionary.com. And in this definition, they define test as the means by which the presence, quality, or genuineness of anything is determined, a means of trial. And the reason why I like this definition so much is because I feel like it fits in well and really defines the biblical definition of a test. Whenever we think of test in the Bible, something like maybe Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 2 and 3, where God reveals that when he was making the Israelites wander in the wilderness for 40 years, it was a test to see if they would follow his commandments. That same theme stays consistent largely in Exodus, Judges chapter 2, all sorts of things like that, just to see if the Israelites would follow God's command. Another really well-known test in the Bible is Job, perhaps maybe even the most well-known. Satan came to God, said that Job was only faithful to him because of the great blessings that he had, and God decided to allow Satan to take those away. And what was God doing in all of these instances? He was testing and seeing the genuineness of the faith of these individuals. Now, I know we just talked about them, but that's actually none of those examples are what we're going to be talking about tonight. We're going to be talking about, perhaps, in my opinion, maybe the most severe test, at least in the Old Testament, and that's the binding of Isaac, Abraham sacrificing his son. But before we get into that, let's take a little bit of background. Remember who Abraham was. So Abraham was a very, very special person, we'll say. He was a very faithful man, and he received many promises, but I kind of summed them up into 4 of the really big ones, we could say. So he received the promise of land, that his name would be made great, that God would make a great nation of Abraham, and perhaps really the most, I don't want to use the word important, but at least the biggest and most significant promise is number 4, that through his seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. And if we were to look in Genesis chapter 12 to see these promises given to Abraham, if we followed up right after that in verses 10 through 20, we would see Abraham put to the test a little bit in a way. Him and his wife are going to Egypt, and on the road to Egypt, and I can only imagine how this conversation went. I couldn't imagine it was a very natural conversation, but Abraham brings up the idea of saying that Sarah is his sister because he's worried that if he claims Sarah as his wife, then the Egyptians will see her beauty and they will kill Abraham. And they go along with the plan, And to some extent, Abraham was proven right that the Egyptians saw the beauty of his wife and they took her. Of course, because of that, God released plagues on Egypt, and eventually, Pharaoh figured out that Sarah was Abraham's wife. And you may ask, well, why is this significant to what we're talking about tonight, about being tested? Well, I would not say it's a stretch to say that Abraham's faith was not fully in the promises that God was giving. If you look at these promises that we have laid out, especially number 4, that through his seed, all the nations of the earth would be blessed, Abraham's not fully trusting in it. Abraham doesn't have a child yet. He cannot die and stay dead, or God's a liar. He wasn't fully trusting in the promise of God. Now, as we transition into our text in Genesis chapter 22, I want to try to take a deeper look into this message. Try to dive really deep, pay attention to the words that are used. And I ask for all of us, because most, if not all of us, know this story pretty well. We know the ending. But I ask, maybe take a step back. Pretend this is maybe even your first time hearing it, and you're just trying to pay great attention to the detail. This is a deep study. And through that, I believe it'll be revealed the true, genuine faith that Abraham had in this instance, and how we can have that same faith like Abraham. And at the conclusion of this lesson, I want to share some really cool similarities between the binding of Isaac and the binding of another very prevalent man, maybe a few thousand years later. But moving along, we'll start in Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 3. Genesis 22, 1 through 3. Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham, and he said to Abraham, and he said, "Here I am." Then he said, "Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey, and 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son. And he split the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. And pretty average, pretty normal start to a chapter, right? Not really. There's so many questions that you can raise just in the first 3 verses here. And one of the questions has really plagued ancient interpreters, commentators for a very long time. And that's the question of, why does God do this? If you look at all the other testing narratives in the Bible, is there really one exactly like this where God asks someone to kill someone else? And let's not pretend that Isaac is deserving of death. Isaac is the child of promise. To our very limited knowledge, because there's not much said about Isaac in the Bible, he's not a wicked person. He's a good man. So, why does God do this? Why does he ask this of Abraham? And one of the earliest interpretations of this actually comes from the book of Jubilee. It's from around 2nd century BC, around that time. And let me say this is from the pseudepigrapha works. I kind of think of them as very similar to the Apocrypha. They're extra biblical, cool to read, but listen closely. Not inspired, not inerrant, not infallible. Everyone heard me say that, right? Not inspired, not infallible. All right. Anyways, in the book of Jubilee, in chapter 17, verse 16, they try to explain why God does this. And Prince Mastema came and he said before God, "Behold, Abraham loves Isaac his son, and he is more pleased with him than everything. Tell him to offer him as a burnt offering upon the altar, and you will see whether he will do this thing. And you will know whether he is faithful in everything in which you test him." And the following verse after this kind of explains that God knew that Abraham would follow through, so he knew everything was going to happen. And also it's important to mention that Prince Mastema is the Satan figure of the book of Jubilee. Now, does this sound similar to maybe any other biblical narrative? Satan coming before God saying that this faithful person would fall if you did this. Maybe sounds pretty similar to the book of Job, we could say. And I would say that's probably, the book of Job heavily influenced this interpretation, most likely. Because, it's so similar. And could this be the reason God did it? It could.
or it could not be. You know, I think one of the most important lessons that I have learned since I've come to Temple Terrace, Florida, studied at FC for a month and a couple of weeks, I'm not sure the exact amount, I've learned that it is okay to say we don't know, and that's okay. It's okay to not know everything because we don't need to know everything. We don't need to know God's reason for doing this. We can trust that God had a good reason for doing it. And I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent away from the scripture, but it's important to realize that we're not going to know everything, and that is completely okay. But moving along in our passage in Genesis chapter 22, there's some interesting language in verse 2, where God tells Abraham, "Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah." Now I want to raise a question. Is Isaac Abraham's only son? No, he's not. Isaac is not an only child, but there is something more special about Isaac, we'll say. He is the only child that Abraham got from Sarah, and he is Abraham's only special child, we'll say, because Isaac is the promised child. And I believe right here early on, God reveals what this test is going to be all about. It is going to be all about testing Abraham's faith in this promise of if Abraham is willing to go through with this and trust in God to fulfill his promise. You know, after seeing all of this, in verse 3, what's Abraham's reaction to all this? You know, God just laid on him that he has to kill his only beloved son. And what's Abraham's reaction? You know, what? Why would I do that? I waited 100 years for Isaac. Why would I do that? Why would you want me to do that? Is that what Abraham said? No, he didn't really say anything, but it does say that he arose early in the morning. It's saying early in the morning. It almost shows a sense of eagerness in a way, a sense of urgency to get this done. And you've got to wonder, why would Abraham be so inclined to go through with this? He's about to kill his beloved son who was brought forth in his old age. We've got to remember, he was 100 years old whenever Isaac was born. And now God's asking him to offer him up as a burnt offering. And I don't think Abraham fully understood at all why God was saying this. But Abraham had faith. And as we move along through the details, I think it'll become more prevalent of that great faith. In Genesis chapter 22, verses 4 through 8. Then on the third day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you." So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hands and a knife, and the two of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father, and said, "My father." "Here I am, son." Then he said, "Look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" And Abraham said, "My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering." So the two of them went together. I'll ask for you to make a little mental note on verse 4, third day. Nothing further than that. Just remember third day. But there's something really interesting in the language Abraham uses in verse 5. And I wonder if you picked up on it. I tried to make it a little bold, but in verse 5, Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you." Now, what is Abraham trying to say here? You know, there could be many possibilities about this. You know, does he just not want Isaac to know? But, you know, the conversation's got to come up at some point. Or what about he just doesn't want his servants to know? Well, I think they might ask maybe a question or two whenever they see Abraham come back without Isaac. So it's really weird. What does Abraham mean by saying, "We will come back to you"? Does he not intend to kill Isaac? Guess we'll have to keep on reading. Also, in verses 6, especially verse 6, 7, and 8, we get some qualities revealed about the person of Isaac. The first point being that Abraham put the wood on Isaac's back to carry to the mountain, which was afar off. You may ask, what's significant about that? Well, I want to point out that Isaac is probably in somewhat of a decent physical condition to bear wood on his back and walk to this mountain, which is said in verse 4 that it's afar off. It shows physical capabilities. Number 2, Isaac spoke to his father. Somewhat insignificant, but still important to the point. And number 3, Isaac sees all the elements for a sacrifice except for the offering itself, which shows his coherence and education about the sacrificial system. And I'm getting some looks like, so what? I mean, really, what does this mean in any way? Well, I want to ask you, whenever you think about this story, how old do you usually envision Isaac? I know growing up and for a large part of my life, I kind of viewed Isaac as maybe even a toddler, young, very, very unable. But upon looking into this, Isaac was most likely, unless there was some serious stuff going on, he was not an infant by any stretch. In fact, he was probably a young man. He was being able to physically carry this wood, to the mountain that was afar off, understanding the sacrificial system. These are not things that a young kid would be able to do. And I think that's kind of important a little bit later, but let's read verses 9 and 10 real quick. Genesis 22, 9 and 10. Then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order. And he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. And we'll stop right there. The climax of the whole event, it's about to go down. But I want to focus on what's not in these 2 verses that we just saw. We see that Abraham binds Isaac. He's getting ready to kill him, but I think it's interesting that in Scripture, it nowhere mentions that Isaac ever resisted this. And we just established that Isaac is able-bodied, he's coherent, he's probably a young man. Let's assume Isaac is 15 years old, just for the sake of an analogy. That would put Abraham at 115. Now, if Isaac was going to resist an 115-year-old man, who do you think's probably going to be the victor in that? I wouldn't say it's probably a stretch to say that the young, physical, able child would probably be able to overpower the elderly Abraham. And I think this points... Now, let me be clear. The author's original intention, my conviction is that this passage is about Abraham's faith, absolutely, wholeheartedly. But does it not seem like Isaac has some sort of faith too? That he has a strong faith? And we don't know what that's in, but there's no hint of Isaac ever rebelling. And we don't know if Abraham explained the situation to him and he was willing to go forward because he had faith in God or because he trusted Abraham, whatever it was. But it does seem like Isaac had faith that he was not going to resist this, that he was going to submit to it just like Abraham was. I think that's significant. I think it shows something about the character of Isaac as well as Abraham. But I don't want to take the focus away from Abraham completely. So let's finish this up. In verses 11 through 14, as Abraham is stretching out the knife to kill his son, an angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." So he said, "Here I am." And he said, "Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you've not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place, "The Lord will provide." As it is said to this day, "In the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." What a great ending. What a great ending to what could have been a very tragic turn of events. I want to ask a question. How easy do you think this was for Abraham? To see his son that he's waited his whole life for, and to see him on an altar, bound to it, with a knife in your hand, and he was going to go through with it. If it had not have been for an act of God, Abraham would have slain his son. What great faith! And what great faith it was. I want to highlight a verse that we've already read. Back to Genesis chapter 22, verse 5. And Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you." Now, as we revisit this, we can see a much clearer answer, especially through the help of other scripture. If we read Hebrews chapter 11, verses 17 through 19, which was the scripture reading, "By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, 'In Isaac your seed shall be called.'" Now in verse 17 and 18, there's almost some similarity back to the beginning of Genesis chapter 22, talking about how this is Abraham's only begotten son. This is the one who the seed is through. And I believe the Hebrew writer further advances the claim that this was a test to see if Abraham had the faith that God would deliver on that fourth promise that we talked about, that through Abraham's seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. And because of Abraham's faith in that promise, verse 19, he concluded that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. We can look back on this story, and we know that it's a narrative about testing, that God decided to test Abraham. Abraham didn't know that. Abraham didn't know that there was a test. But you know what Abraham did know? Abraham did know that God's promise is not slack, that God will always fulfill his promise. And Abraham might not have understood everything, but he knew because of that promise that Isaac was the promised child, that God could even raise him from the dead. You think Abraham knew anybody that had been raised from the dead? I mean, that was a foreign concept to him. But he didn't doubt God. He didn't doubt God's ability to deliver. And that's the great faith that we should all possess. Have you ever heard anybody compare our life to the story of this? That's not the best way to put it. Has anybody ever asked you, put yourself in the spot of Abraham, that if God called to you tomorrow and said to sacrifice your son, how would you feel about that? And while I believe that is offered in good faith, it's not exactly the same, because for anybody's child that is out here that may be listening, anybody's child, there's no promise through your child that all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. But we do have promises for our tests and trials today. For example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, "No temptation has overtaken you except such as common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. But with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it." And you may be thinking, well, this verse is talking about temptation, not testing. Do we really think God is going to test us beyond what we can handle? Is God looking for us to fail? No, it's quite the opposite. Tests are not meant to make us fail. The tests of God are meant to edify us. And we have that promise in James chapter 1, verses 2 through 6. To count it all joy when we fall into trials of various kinds, knowing that the testing of our faith produces steadfastness. And when we let that steadfastness have its work in our lives, it produces stronger faith. And if we need help in those trials, God will help us. If we go to him in prayer and ask of it of him, He will give to all liberally without reproach if we come to him in faith. And that's a paraphrase of James chapter 1, verses 2 through 6. But it's the point that the tests that God gives us are to help us. They're to make us better. And that we can know through all of our tests that God is with us. Even to the very end of Genesis chapter 22, God still provided for Abraham and Isaac. He provided the sacrifice so that Isaac didn't have to die. God is always with his people. And as we come to the close this evening, I think it is great to share some similarities between Isaac and Jesus' crucifixion, because you would not believe how many similarities there actually are. The first similarity, both were sacrificed in Moriah or around that general area. The second one, both were willing sacrifices. Both fathers were willing to send their only begotten sons to die. The third similarity, and this is just the 9 that I've come up with or seen. There's plenty more, I'm sure. But number 3, both were beloved only sons. A lot of similarities so far. It gets even better, honestly. Number 4, both carried the wood for their sacrifices. Number 5, both were dead for 3 days. And I know we might be thinking, well, Isaac never actually died. But if you look at the wording in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 19, it says that Abraham figuratively received Isaac back from the dead. In Abraham's mind, Isaac was rendered dead at that point. Going along with that, both were resurrected. Same deal. Number 7, both stories had a lamb with thorns on its head. Number 9, both involved a substitutionary sacrifice. In the case of Isaac, God sent a lamb so he didn't have to die. And in all of our cases, God sent a lamb so we didn't have to die. And number 9, and the most important, frankly, both stories involve God providing for his people. You know, we heard a lesson this morning about choosing life or death, and how the choice has been the same since the beginning of humanity, that Adam and Eve had the choice of life or death, and today we have the choice of life or death. Can we have a faith like Abraham and choose the life? Through all the trials, through all the tests, have our faith wholly in God and in Jesus Christ to deliver us? Or do we choose death? Do we choose eternal separation from God? It doesn't seem like a hard answer, but we know narrow is the gate and wide is the way which leads to destruction. It takes a faith like Abraham to make it to heaven. And we can all strive to be like that, because that faith doesn't come overnight. It comes through prayer, meditation, studying, and most importantly, it comes from help from God. If there are any among us tonight who have not obeyed the gospel, have not put their faith wholly in Jesus Christ, had their sins washed away by the waters of baptism, we invite you to wait no longer. We invite you to accept this Lord's invitation. And we always extend this invitation at the end of each service. But just to let anybody know, this invitation is extended every single second of every single day, of every single month, of every single year. The Lord's invitation waits for you to take it. Please, if you have any need, come forward as we stand and as we sing.